joining today's webinar. On how sustainable is your farm, a practical guide to energy and carbon efficiency. I am Gemma Bauer, so I'm Head of Marketing at NFU Energy, and today I'm joined by Erin Roosbridge, who is our Senior Projects Engineer, specialising in energy efficiency and carbon reduction strategies. And then I'm also joined by Thomas Ovenden, who is our Renewable Specialist, who will look into, your renewable options on farm, and also some compliance and incentive schemes around energy efficiency as well. Just to let you all know that this session is being recorded, so if you need to jump off at any time or would like to watch this back in the future, we will be uploading it to our YouTube channel. We'll also send around an email following this webinar should you wish to play it back or have any comments or wish to get in touch with us in the future. So because of this being a webinar, there won't be the opportunity to engage at the end. However, we will do a Q&A. So you can, if you do have a question, use the chat function or the Q&A function within this webinar, where you can input any questions and we will come back to them at the end. If we also run out of time, we can always pick up your questions and email back to you. So without further ado, I will continue with the webinar. So just to give you a quick intro to NFU Energy for those of you that have joined us and don't know who we are. So we are owned by the National Farmers Union. We are one of the UK's leading and trusted providers of sustainable energy solutions. And it's our mission really to make sure that, the needs of the public and private sector organisations are met around, making sure that you are sustainable, that you're meeting all the energy regulations and compliance regulations, and essentially just making sure that all of your energy needs are met. So we have two sides to the business. We have the one side that is our energy contracts brokerage. So we help find our customers the best energy deals within the market. We offer buying groups to NFU members in particular, where we pool together NFU members, and we have that greater buying power, which means you get cheaper energy bills off the back of that. And then the other part of our business is the energy consultancy. So looking at ways that you can become more efficient on farm, how you can reduce your carbon output as well, and also making sure that you're compliant in everything that you do. So there are the key areas that we can help your business. So just looking at today's agenda, so we'll go into sort of sustainability in farming and what that looks like and why it matters. We'll look at energy efficiency, the quick wins that you can do on farm to become more sustainable, and how you can perhaps reduce, your carbon footprint and strategies around that. We'll also look at, what options you have for renewable energy. Whether that's you have the upfront costs ready, or perhaps you need a little help with, setting up renewables, whether that's through sort of a loan or a blended power purchase agreement. We'll look at those options for you. And then we'll just touch on at the end as well the various compliance and incentives around energy efficiency within your business, and how you can essentially generate a bit of income on farm off the back of that. So sustainability in farming. So sustainability is becoming increasingly important today, and not just for environmental health with soil fertility, improving water quality, and supporting biodiversity, and of course reducing those greenhouse gas emissions, but it can also help farms of all sizes be more profitable and enhance food security by creating more efficient, stable and resilient food system. So, why does it matter to your business in particular? So, there are the regulatory changes that are coming in that are increasing, encouraging more farms to be more sustainable. Of course, you have that consumer demand for eco-friendly practices as well, pressure throughout the supply chain. Also, we're finding, the more efficient and sustainable your business is, there's the opportunity for cost savings. Sometimes when we found with customers where we've gone out on site and conducted, energy efficiency audits, looking at ways of, improving efficiency on farm can actually result in significant savings with energy bills. So there's that element to it as well, but also to enhance that biodiversity. It's good practice to ensure that, sustainable your farm is sustainable, and of course then it's future proofing your operations for the future. So I'm going to pass on to my colleague Erin, who will come in because he will give you a bit of an update on how you can become more energy efficient yourselves, and essentially where to start with sustainability. So I will pass over to Erin.
Cheers, Gemma. Hopefully you can all hear me all right. So I'll start today talking about sort of the power of data. Data is the most important starting place when it comes to energy sustainability, certainly. And essentially, you're not able to effectively target any improvements to your business, and you're not able to measure any impacts of any changes that you make unless you can measure your usage and measure how that usage changes and understand where your energy is being used, whether that's through enhanced sub-metering, whether it's improvement to any temperature sensors or other sensors that you've got across your site, whether it's something simple like including the energy infrastructure as part of your standard weekly site walkthrough, making sure if there's any motors on site, are they making any strange sounds that they're not supposed to be, going into the cupboards that maybe you don't always go into to look at meters and see if they are incrementing in the way that they should. And then also frequent analysis, give somebody responsibility for that data, whether that's somebody internally or whether it's an external consultant, somebody like NFU Energy, keeping on top of data and measuring and monitoring that data is really essential. So on the slide here, understanding energy bills, that is something which, it's fairly simple, but it's something which can quite quickly get overlooked. There's parts of energy bills which are not the consumption parts, the sort of non-commodities is what they're called, such as standing charges, which have seen a massive increase recently, and understanding where those costs are coming from as part of your bills and how you might be able to reduce those can lead to pretty big cost savings as well as energy savings. Granularity is really important when it comes to energy. So it's not only about how much you're using, but also when throughout the day, because particularly when it comes to changing the system that you've got or including some sort of self-generation such as renewables, knowing when that consumption occurs and what piece of kit is using that consumption is really important. So something that we offer, an energy audit, we can come to site and we can analyze your data and if needs be, collect some of our own or install some data loggers to over a longer period of time, collect data at a granular level if that's not something that you've got. And we can use that to pinpoint any energy trends in your data and find ways to save you money as well as energy. Also, feasibility studies. Once you've got a good understanding of your data, once you've got somebody looking after it and you've got a good handle on when and how much data of energy that you're using, then the next step is to start reduce. That can be any number of improvements. I'll get into some of those a bit later. And then verification. So as I said, keep on top of that ongoing monitoring to make sure that if you do make any changes, then they are working as they should. There's a bit on the slide here about feasibility. So once you've reduced your energy, then the next step is to sort of offset what's remaining. So self-generation through renewables, there's lots of different types of technology that you could invest into, and there's lots of ways to determine whether that is a viable investment. And we do offer feasibility studies where we'll look into the technical, the economical, and the logistical feasibility of any system that you might be thinking about. Next slide, please. In terms of energy efficiency, I've got some examples here of typical energy savings measures that we might identify at various different sites that we go to. They are all, specific to your site. There's not a one size fits all, but these are some common things that can be done. In principle, energy efficiency is the ratio of energy input to useful product output. So each of these measures is going to either reduce the inputs by having more efficient kit, by improving stuff like maintenance, the timing, matching your load with the equipment size. All of those things will reduce your inputs and reduce the amount of wasted energy. But also there are ways to improve efficiency by increasing your outputs. So reducing the amount of waste that you have, improvements to livestock health if you're farming livestock, those kind of things can increase your output whilst maintaining your energy, and that also increases efficiency. So some of the examples that are written here, I'll start on the right hand side: insulation and sealing air leaks. So particularly in any temperature controlled environment, in a cold store or in a heated space, making sure that there is adequate insulation, that the doors are sealing in a way which doesn't allow drafts to come through. Particularly in chilled environments, having speed doors and automatic opening and closing can save an awful lot of energy. Same thing goes with docks, making sure that they're well sealed so that when you're loading and unloading HGVs, you're not leaking a bunch of warm air into your chilled environment. When you do that, you're introducing a lot of water, a lot of moisture, which can condense in your cold store and lead to issues with your equipment, as well as issues with the energy introduced of chilling that water and then freezing it. LED lighting, most sites will use lights to some degree in some areas, and it's a very low-hanging fruit. It's something which it's almost every case it's worth replacing your lights with LEDs. Historically, a few years ago, our advice was always to wait until your current fixtures fail, and then once your current fixtures have failed, replacing them with LED alternatives would be beneficial over the lifetime of the light. That balance has somewhat shifted with energy prices getting as high as they are. It's now, in a lot of cases, it's worth outright replacement. Whatever you've got currently, if it's not LED, the chances are it might be worthwhile to take them out and replace them with LED immediately. LED bulbs are much more efficient. Depending on what type of bulb you've got in there previously, you can get up to 80%, sometimes more savings. And in also doing that, they produce a lot less heat. So talking about a chilled environment again, if you're lighting that chilled environment and you're using a sodium bulb, for example, then that's going to be introducing a lot of heat into that chilled space, which then your refrigeration system needs to work harder to expel that heat. So that's another benefit of having LEDs, is that the most of the heat is not generated at the bulb, and there is less heat in general. Energy efficient appliances, heating and cooling systems. At some stage, whatever system that you've got for heating or cooling will degrade and will age to a point where it's running inefficiently and it needs to be replaced. When they do need replacing, in a lot of cases, replacing them with the highest efficiency piece of kit that is available will lead to large savings over the lifetime of the unit. Simple things like condensing boilers or having heat pumps for, even if it's just preheat for a higher temperature hot water vessel, integrating a heat pump into your heating system can save an awful lot of energy, if not necessarily money. Regular maintenance is something that is really essential, and something that can often be overlooked because it's a bit more invisible than some of the other things that I've spoken about. But it's really essential. Anything that's degrading, if we're talking about a temperature controlled environment, then any sort of holes, or if a forklift has gone through and it's sort of dinked the side of the panels, or if there's dust buildup on any of the indoor or outdoor evaporation condenser units, if there's ice buildup on any of those units, as well, if on any of your heating infrastructure, if there's insulation around the pipework that's starting to degrade, all of these things will lead to energy inefficiency, and they're really easy to solve and usually quite cheap to solve. So that is part of ongoing maintenance schedules, making sure that you've got a contractor who can come and do those checks regularly to make sure that your system's working as it should. But also it's part of that energy infrastructure walkthrough that I mentioned before, of whenever you're doing a walkthrough of your site, whether that's daily or weekly, making sure that you include some of the key sort of energy using areas, knowing what to look out for, and making note of them so that they can be fixed. Behavioral changes, those are some of the most difficult things to change within a business. But there is a lot to be said about changing people's behavior in simple ways, such as switching off lights when an area is not in use, switching off heating when that area is not in use. Those sort of small plug-in electric heaters, I can't tell you the number of times that I've been around to maintenance sheds or small little offices that are on buildings or in small canteen areas where those have been left on and not really thought about. But giving somebody some responsibility who uses that space, educating the workers, the employees on what it means to leave those pieces of kit on, can help an awful lot. And when educational things aren't happening, you can maybe introduce some sort of scheme of energy savers or whatever in your business to sort of incentivize people to think a bit more about it. Also, removing the human element helps a lot. So installing timers and installing switches, anti-tamper mechanisms onto your heating and cooling HVAC system in an office environment, for example, will save a lot of money. And then finally, once you've made as many changes as you sort of can, once your processes have been optimized in terms of efficiency, then that's the point where you should start to consider offsetting with your own sort of renewable generation. Ultimately, if you oversize a renewable generator so that you're powering an inefficient load, then not only are you going to spend more because you bought a larger generator, but you're also powering your own waste. So it's always, I would recommend, the first step is to reduce the amount of energy that you're using, optimize your process, and then afterwards think about installing some renewable power or renewable heat to offset the remaining bit. And next slide, please. Carbon reporting. So before I get too deep into the weeds of carbon reporting, there's a couple of basics that I should cover. The first one being scopes. So if you've ever spoken with anybody about carbon reporting, the likelihood is that they've mentioned scopes 1, 2, and 3. And those are part of the GHG protocols sort of nomenclature. And what they mean, scope 1 is your direct emissions. So that's any emissions that are occurring from an activity that you're doing, which directly releases emissions, such as burning fuel, road transport fuel as well, stationary combustion, mobile combustion. If you're applying fertilizer to your land, then there's an amount of direct emissions from nitrogen that's coming from that. If you're keeping any livestock, then there's direct emissions from those. Scope 2 is your indirect emissions from energy. So if you're connected to the electricity grid and you're importing electricity, then there is emissions that you inherit, which are associated with the generation upstream of that electricity. Same thing if you're part of a heat network or if you're buying steam or heat directly from a third party, then there's an amount of scope 2 emissions which are inherited from the generation of that energy. And then finally, scope 3 is all other indirect emissions. So anything else that you can think of upstream or downstream, whether it's packaging, the manufacturing production of that packaging has got emissions associated with it, and some of those those will be accounted for within a scope 3 calculation. Same thing with water, with the manufacturing of any fuels or fertilizers that you use. Downstream, there's the end use of the product, and there's the waste and disposal of that product as well. So knowing what the scopes are can start to inform you on where you might set your boundaries, which are the most important decision that you'll make when it comes to calculating your carbon emissions. I'll get onto boundaries a little bit more later. activities and emissions factors are words that get thrown around a lot. Essentially, an activity is anything that happens, anything that a business does, which produces greenhouse gas emissions. And an emissions factor is the way to convert your activity data into carbon emissions, carbon equivalent emissions. So your activity might be a certain number of liters of fuel, and then your emissions factor is your kilograms of carbon per liter of fuel. So with both of those, you can figure out your total emissions, although it can be more complex for different types of activities. And then carbon footprint is probably the word that I've heard misused more than any other in my career. A carbon footprint is a very specific definition. It's a life cycle assessment, a full cradle to grave assessment of a thing, whether it's a product or an entity, a corporate entity, or whatever it is. A carbon footprint is very specifically a full life cycle analysis. Often it's better to talk about a carbon account or a carbon calculation rather than a carbon footprint, because very often if you're excluding any of the activities or if you're excluding any of the scopes, then what you've produced is no longer a carbon footprint. When it comes to boundaries, it's, like I said here, it's the very first decision that you need to make, and it's one of the most important ones. The way to simplify where you're going to put the boundaries around your calculation, I've got a couple of bullet points there. The first one's data. As I was talking about earlier, data is so incredibly important that if you don't have the right granularity of data, then there's no way that you can produce a carbon calculation which has very much sort of meaning to it. If all you've got is the total quantities, and if you've only got that for certain bits of data, if you're having to use lots of industry averages or third-party sources to get some of your data, then the accuracy of the final number that you end up with is going to be worse. And so the sort of time and money commitment to producing that is going to be worse. Ownership, whether it's financial control, whether it's operational control, or whether it's some other sort of, if you're getting contractors to come in, then that's a place that you can start to draw boundaries of are these emissions something that should be accounted for, should be inherited by my business? And sort of most importantly, really, is the purpose. There's ultimately three reasons why people would do a carbon footprint or a carbon calculation. The first one's compliance. Is it the government or is somebody in your supply chain, like a retailer, are they forcing you or asking you very nicely to do a carbon calculation? The other one is marketing. So a lot of businesses do carbon accounting for marketing purposes. And then sort of finally is sustainability. Often you need a financial incentive. Everybody wants to be sustainable, but carbon calculations come at a cost. And if there isn't a gain to be made, then sustainability is often not a large enough purpose. But once you know the purpose for doing your calculation, then it starts to become easier on drawing boundaries. If it's compliance related, the likelihood is those boundaries have already been drawn for you. If it's marketing related, then you can set the boundaries however you would like to, but you need to have some sort of transparency because your users or your clients are going to be asking questions if it's something that you use for marketing. Next slide, please. And then method. So once you've sort of figured out what you want to do in terms of or how you want to approach your carbon calculation, then there's a couple of ways that you can quantify your emissions, and each of them are appropriate in different sort of situations. So the first thing's online calculators. These are the simplest, they should be the easiest to use, and they're the sort of first port of call for a lot of businesses. Most of them are free to use, which is a massive benefit. It's only a time commitment. The sort of downside is that what you get out of it is a number, and then it's up to you to sort of do something with that. But they can highlight some sort of hotspots within your business of where emissions are coming from, and then you can maybe start to target those. A slightly more detailed approach could maybe be a bespoke calculation, engaging with a consultancy such as us, NFU Energy. We can do bespoke calculations to produce a sort of transparent report that goes into exactly how we've reached the numbers that we have, what data sets we used, if there was any estimations, where, any alignments with specific guidance, specifically something like past 2050, which is a set of guidance for product carbon footprints specifically. And then the GHG protocol I've mentioned before, it's got several different guidance documents for projects, products, or corporate entities, business reports. Both of those sets of guidance, past 2050 and GHG protocol, are both derived from the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change calculation methods. And if you want to align with one of those pieces of guidance, then that might make a more robust calculation in terms of, if it's used for marketing or such. So there are lots of ways to go about calculating your carbon. If it's not a mandatory compliance reason, then you're sort of free to choose whichever one you like and justify them however you wish. In terms of reductions, once you've figured out how much carbon you're emitting and from where, one of the easiest wins, I suppose, in terms of reductions is, as I've spoken about earlier, energy efficiency. If a large part of your emissions are coming from energy efficiency, then the things that I've mentioned before earlier today are your best bet in terms of reductions. If it's other than that, then production efficiency, whether that's limiting the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that's being used, or whether it's improving your animal health or genetics to a point where the amount of produce that you get at the end for the amount of emissions that you're releasing decreases. And then finally, when it comes to eliminating or reaching net zero, as it were, then offsetting is inevitable for most businesses, whether that's an energy offset through renewable generation or whether it's a carbon offset through something like the woodlands or grassland management or biodiversity net gain, those sorts of things. Those are your options. I think that's my final slide. So I think I'll pass back now
Brilliant.
to, I think my colleague Tom is going to take over from this point.
Thanks, Erin, and I'll just introduce Thomas. So Thomas is our renewable specialist here at NFU Energy, and he'll look into the various options that are available for renewables. So over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Gemma, and thanks, Erin, for the introduction there. So yeah, on to the renewables part of the webinar. And first question for many people is why you would consider renewables, and there are a number of options, but for this specific webinar we're going to focus on the three on the screen. So the first one being future-proofing your business, and there are essentially two avenues that you could go down with that route. The first is to reduce your reliance on fossil fuels, on conventional fuels, and to move away from those as they begin to increase in price, to essentially confirm your energy bills as they are with your renewable energy system, making great savings there. And the other option is to reduce pressures from your supply chain. Many suppliers are now focusing on their farmers and their producers to go green, to move away from fossil fuels and into renewables. So in order to have renewables on your site, that will put you in good stead moving forward, and keep a lot of those contracts in place. Net zero targets are a very common discussion point, especially as the government has legally committed the UK to reaching net zero in terms of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The NFU themselves are committed to net zero carbon emissions, I believe, by 2040. So to commit your own site or farm or whatever to a net zero target, and trying to reach it ahead of that 2050 target may be something that you are focusing your business on to be considered sustainable. And yeah, renewables are a key way of reducing those emissions and getting to the end goal that you have set in mind. And lastly, one of the topics that convinces a lot of people to move into renewable energy systems is to save money, and this can be done through a number of different avenues, and I will come on to those later. But in terms of solar PV, probably the most commonly installed renewable energy system. Payback periods are usually commonly 5 to 7 years for a standard system. This can be reduced down to perhaps even 3 years with the right system, the right site, if everything falls into place. On the other hand, if you are really convinced on renewables and it may not be the right fit for you, you could see paybacks up to 10 years or so, but the lifespan of a solar PV system will be across a 25-year period. So there will always be long-term savings to be made. But if your focus is on quick wins, then I would recommend getting some initial consultancy in place to know that your system is going to produce those savings that you need. For example, the feasibility studies that Erin mentioned earlier could highlight what your payback period might be for a renewable energy system, and whether it's going to meet those goals that you need. So that would be a good intention. And yeah, if we move on to the next slide. So when you begin to look into renewable energy for your, again, farm site, wherever you may be looking to install it, there are going to be challenges that you face. Unfortunately, that can't be avoided. And one of the most common restrictions or challenges that many people face now is grid connections. There is obviously ongoing work to upgrade grid infrastructure throughout the nation, but your site in particular may be limited. What we can do is in those early stages look at, again, a feasibility study or even just a very simple request to your district network operator or DNO to establish what level of capacity you may have to connect a renewable energy system into the grid, whether you are looking at having to limit your generation, limit the size of the structure, or whether you have free reign to install the size and system that you need. So that would always be one of the things recommended to pursue early on, is speaking to your district network operator or conducting some consultancy to know where you stand with your grid connection and grid capacity. Planning restrictions do come into play with a lot of renewable energy systems. This can be something large like a wind turbine, which will have a very in-depth planning consultancy stage, but something such as rooftop solar, again, one of the more commonly installed systems, no planning should be required. It should fall under permitted development rights. If you do want to check that, you can get a certificate of lawful development, I believe it's called, from a planning consultancy or from your local planning authority. Both should be able to take care of that. But yeah, if your hope is for a quick and easy renewable energy system for your site, rooftop solar would be the way to go, especially from a planning perspective. A ground-mounted system likely won't have many barriers in terms of planning, but there would be additional things to cover off compared to a rooftop system. In terms of which installer to go with, I know everyone will have heard potential horror stories about installers having gone under and not being able to maintain a certain system. That is why it's worth looking at installers that have the right accreditation that come with approval either from referrals, recommendations, or from a trusted consultant. You'd want to make sure that the installer has been operating for quite a while, that they have a number of existing systems that they can show and demonstrate to you to let you know their level of performance. And if you are still unsure, you can always have your quote checked by an expert or a consultant or a third party, just to make sure that what is being offered to you is correct, is coming at the right price, is the hardware that's been recommended is of a top tier. If you don't know where to make a start in terms of looking for installers, NFU Energy do have a list of approved partners that we work with for all manner of installations. This can be solar, wind turbines, heat pumps, electric vehicle chargers, all sorts, and we can help you find the most appropriate one for you, or we can at least give you a good starting point and areas to look at. Three-phase power can be, well, in fairness, to switch it, single-phase power can be a limiter to the size of the system that you can install on your site. Three-phase power can be upgraded for that site. It can upgrade to three-phase power by speaking to your district network operator, your DNO. The DNO is the only entity that would be able to upgrade you from single-phase to three-phase power. And the cost for that upgrade, I believe, is anywhere from about £1,800 up to £6,000 plus. It is very dependent on the site, on the complexity of the project, and if that is a potential concern or a potential route that you need to go down to ensure that you are installing the size of system that you need, it is worth having that initial discussion either with your district network operator or a suitable energy consultant. Three-phase power can ensure that you install a size of system required for the site. Single phase would limit you to to my knowledge, a 20 kilowatt inverter, but most of the time, the size of the project that we see under a single phase connection is about 10 kilowatts or less. To go above that, it is worth having 3-phase power at your site. Anything such as a wind turbine as well will require 3-phase power just to the size of the system and the level of generation they produce. And one of the challenges that again comes up most commonly is the cost of the project. If you are looking at approaching lenders or providers of finance, then a feasibility report can let you know that the project that you are looking into is, financially sound, that you will get your money back over a set period of time, and break it down into where that money will come from, whether that's through exporting energy back to the grid, whether that's through offsetting your bills. And then there are other avenues to go down in terms of costs and savings on these systems. Government grants is one that has been a bit of a discussion point in recent months, mostly due to the Improving Farm Productivity grant. This is now unfortunately closed to new applicants, but having seen the level of success and applications that were brought in by that grant, I wouldn't be surprised if those grants again continue to come out and become available, but all of that will remain to be seen over the coming year. And blended PPAs or power purchase agreements are a final opportunity to save on the cost, or that initial cost of system. May not give you the absolute benefit you would see on owning the system outright, but it does have great potential. So I think that is discussed in the next slide, please. Yeah, so there are, from our perspective, 3 ways that you can go about investing in renewable energy for the site. The first is the most common way, and that is to purchase the system outright. This is to work with an installer. They will fit the system for you, you will fund it, and you will reap all of the benefits of that system. We at NFU Energy can provide a one-stop shop service for this. This is the recommended installers that we mentioned previously. This is linking you with appropriate partners for every stage of that project and supporting you throughout, including a review of the quote from our installer, so you know that there is an independent review of the work that has been carried out. So that is the first avenue we would probably point you down. The other 2 look at essentially ways of offsetting that initial cost. The first would be to secure finance, either through an approved asset finance lender or otherwise. Again, NFU Energy can recommend prospective suppliers of this finance option, but I'm sure many of you will either have your own or there will be other opportunities to explore. And lastly, again, onto the power purchase agreements. This would be a installer or supplier fitting the system free of charge. Then they will cover off all operation and maintenance of these systems. These systems will generate energy, but as the system is not owned by you, the energy will be fed back to you at a discounted rate. So you don't have to take on the financial burden of the equipment, of the maintenance, or anything like that. You will secure long-term energy savings for you and for the site. And there are often opportunities to then purchase that system as part of the agreement with the supplier. So it is a way of getting that sort of very short-term wins without giving out a huge amount of expense. But there are different matters that you need to be taken into account when considering a power purchase agreement. But yeah, on to the next slide, please. And in terms of potentially other renewable energy generation systems or energy generation systems, they will need to be kept compliant with government regulations. And the 3 that NFU Energy can support with and will do so most commonly are the Renewable Heat Incentive, otherwise known as RHI. That scheme is closed to new applicants, but you can still buy an RHI accredited boiler and through that benefit from the scheme. And if you have an existing boiler, this can be replaced with a new or more efficient boiler, and you'll continue to receive that RHI tariff. The Climate Change Agreement, otherwise known as CCA, is a scheme designed to drive efficiency within energy intensive businesses. This can include industries such as pig and poultry farmers or horticulture, most specifically. And lastly, Combined Heat and Power Quality Assurance, CHPQA, is a scheme that has been designed to promote and incentivize the use of specific systems, combined heat and power systems, which improve efficiency of those systems and to roll them out across a wider area. So I'll go into a bit more detail on each, starting with the Renewable Heat Incentive. As mentioned, it is a scheme. It's designed to promote the adoption of renewable heating technologies throughout the UK. as I mentioned, it is closed to new applicants. But that doesn't mean you can't still benefit from the technologies that it covers, and you would still need to remain compliant with the scheme's regulations. As I mentioned, there are two ways to become involved in this scheme moving forwards, either purchasing an RHI accredited boiler and through that benefiting from the scheme, or if you have an existing one, again, replacing it, still continuing to receive that RHI tariff, as it is very valuable to those that possess it, but yeah, making sure that your boiler is more efficient. But in order to change that system, you would need to amend your RHI application. This is work that NFU Energy can undertake for you and support you throughout that process. Ofgem, who ensure that all of these systems are kept compliant. As a result, we'll need to audit your system twice throughout the RHI scheme. If you are concerned about an audit coming up, NFU Energy can support you in making sure that you are prepared for that audit. But it is ultimately best to make sure that you are always audit ready, whether Ofgem are coming or when that may be. And lastly, the heat meters that are involved with the RHI tariff would need to be recalibrated after 10 years within the scheme. So if you are concerned that that 10-year period is coming to an end or coming up soon, it's worth reaching out and just discussing how we can look at getting those heat meters recalibrated or changed if required. But I think recalibration is usually the way forward. The second point that we raised was the Climate Change Agreement, again, CCA, a scheme designed to drive energy efficiency within certain energy intensive businesses with the ultimate aim of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The benefits of this are that you would pay reduced rates on the climate change levy tax or CCL tax. These savings can then be reinvested back into the business to ensure that you are developing and promoting advancement of the business, and ultimately can help you achieve your own company goals, whether that is limiting your carbon footprint, improving the sustainability of the business, or ultimately reaching that net zero target that I discussed earlier. If you are looking into the sort of CCA scheme, there has now been a 6-year extension as a result of a recent UK government consultation. This means that instead of the deadline being 2024 this year, it's now been extended to 2030, therefore providing a lot of benefit to energy intensive industries. And through the NFU CCL scheme, pigs and poultry farmers, as well as horticultural businesses, can receive expert guidance on how to meet these energy reduction targets that you are required to meet, maximize their savings, all the while still remaining really competitive with reducing your carbon footprint. And then lastly, back onto combined heat and power quality assurance, CHP QA. This scheme is designed to promote the use of CHP systems, which are great because they generate both electricity and heat simultaneously, making them very efficient compared to perhaps a duality of having two systems at once, or compared to more conventional power generation methods. Again, they're most used or most applicable in industries where you would need both of these energy generations on site at the same time. The objectives of the CHP QA scheme are, essentially encourage the deployment of these systems nationwide to ensure that sites are improving their energy efficiency by the dual generation method, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by utilizing the standard waste heat, which from other methods would just be wasted, but from CHP system can still be utilized. And to that note, sites such as horticultural sites can also make use of additional waste, the sort of carbon dioxide emissions. This can be utilized within the site itself. CHP QA scheme also would enhance the resilience of energy supply by decentralizing generation, making sure that it is localized to each site as required. And there are financial incentives and regulatory support for CHP projects as well. And just to link the CHP QA scheme to the aforementioned climate change levy tax, you can claim 100% tax relief on the gas used in CHP systems, provided that you have a CHP QA certification. Just to wrap that up there, and that is the sort of 3 areas of compliance covered off that NFU Energy can support with, as well as the area of renewable energy as well. So I think that brings my area there to a close. I'm going to hand back to Gemma just to wrap things up.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom, and thank you to Erin, our 2 speakers today. So I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll see if anybody has any questions. So I'll just go to the chat. So I haven't had any questions come in yet. So if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat or the Q&A feature. I'll give a couple of minutes, and if not, we can give you 15 minutes back on your day. And as I said at the start of the session, we will be sending an email around just with all the points highlighted within the webinar today, and also a watch again link should you wish to, watch it again in the future. So no, I think we can call it there. So just to say a huge thank you for joining us today. As I say, we will be in touch with our contact details, and everything that's been mentioned today, we can help with, whether that's, looking at carbon accounting, energy efficiency audits on site, anything related to renewable energy. Give the team a call, and we'd be more than happy to, talk through what we can do over the phone for your business. So thank you very much, and thanks to Thomas and Erin for speaking today. Thank you all.